Welcome to the Trauma Informed Lens podcast. Each week, Matt, Kurt, Jerry, and the occasional special guest explore how the trauma-informed paradigm challenges traditional beliefs and approaches concerning a wide variety of areas. This podcast addresses psychological trauma in an educational manner and is not designed to replace mental health treatment. If anything in this podcast makes you feel uncomfortable or anxious, please talk to a mental health professional.
Looking at how we can put the trauma-informed lens on leadership and organizations. So excited to continue our exploration. Kurt, unfortunately, was not able to join us today. He had a meeting pop up. So I'm excited to talk about this with Jerry because for about 2.5, 3 years, Jerry was my supervisor. So I'm sure we both have some fun stories to tell about that. As always, we start out with our bright, shiny object of the week. And first of all, I want to throw out there, if you're on the video, you can see my shirt. I got some more swag, Jerry, from a training I did with Circle at the City, a great homeless respite care facility in Phoenix. And got to tour some of their buildings and just a beautiful place for folks with medical conditions that don't have a place to live to get out of the hospital and really get a great level of care while they recover and hopefully get into housing as well. So just throw a shout out to some of our new listeners from Circle the City. And I'll throw in a bright, shiny object of the week as well. I know I see a lot of people talking about this on social media, but watched Leaving Neverland, the documentary on sexual abuse and Michael Jackson. And it's one of those that continues to spin in my head. The interesting thing that just keeps this, that is unlike a lot of things that, especially as a therapist working with a lot of youth that have experienced sexual abuse, there's a part of this story that seems so incredibly familiar. Their language, their shame, all this stuff seems familiar, but there's this interesting dynamic to the specific abuse, especially these two individuals who are central to this documentary because it was Michael Jackson, who in many ways helped them in their careers while doing horrific alleged abuse at the same time. And it puts a variable that's not totally foreign, but there's been few people in my lifetime who has been as famous. And so you see the power and everything come out and, big trigger warning for the show because it's one of the most powerful documentaries I've ever seen on childhood sexual abuse. With that said, I think any of our listeners who it's on HBO, watch it, will probably have it spinning in their heads for weeks after like I am. So I highly recommend it with the big trigger warning that it's hard to watch at times. So that's been my sort of dominated my thinking at least the last couple of days since I've seen that. So Jerry, what's on your mind this week?
Well, I think this concept you talked about at Neverland of bearing witness to the stories will fit really well with our talking about supervision because so much of the work that we do, we have to bear witness to horrible stories and people living in horrible conditions sometimes. And so I think as you watch it and have that reaction, how many times in the agencies or in the situations you worked with did we kind of minimize hearing those stories? So I think it's a nice segue to what we're going to be talking about.
Absolutely. And I think the support, especially early on in my career that I got through supervision.
Right. So, I think for the shiny object this week is the fact that these things are being talked about. You talk about the power of a Michael Jackson but the power of a priest, the power of, powerful people in the film industry. The power, right, is that, the power of a parent. Really, when we think about trauma, it's this feeling of I'm helpless and powerless to respond in a way that keeps myself safe. Mm-hmm. And in a way, listening to Michael Cohen in the Congress, you can have different thoughts about what he should be. He's a bright man. He's certainly capable, but he really talked about being in this position with somebody who exerted a power, a level of leadership, charisma to kind of, in some ways, get him to engage in behaviors that were incongruent with what he would normally see himself with. So, yeah. I think that the fact that so many, I guess I want a bright, shiny object, is how many people who are doing this work are really managing that power. Mm-hmm. And really take my hats off to the situations in which people are doing really good work and being respectful of the clients and the situations they're in. And really, when we talk about these situations, it really is for us to kind of learn about how easy it is to fall into that, but not to lose sight of how really incredible it is that so many people step up and hold the space for people who are really, in some ways, used to being in a one-down position with somebody who has authority.
Yeah.
So I think that's a really, as we get into this topic, to kind of honor that piece of the work that people are doing.
Absolutely. And to kind of transition us in, this has been something I've really thought a lot about, in especially maybe the last 6 months, especially so much so that, my work with health clinics, which is vastly different from how I started my career out in mental health, child welfare. I'm going to present, and I haven't created the presentation yet, but working with somebody from Atlanta, but we're presenting on thinking about supervision. If your medical clinic is going to become trauma informed, what is the role of supervision? Because I count myself incredibly fortunate, including my work with you, Jerry, when you were my direct supervisor, is, growing up again, professionally in the child welfare system, even juvenile justice, I had most often in most of my early jobs, I had about an hour of supervision every week. And I was like a puppy looking for a treat with this supervision, because even though I was in graduate school, which I also got supervision there as well, I grew professionally rapidly. I hope my supervisors would agree with that, but I had that hour. And so part of that for me was holding a lot of my experiences, like you mentioned. I experienced vicarious trauma early on in my career. I experienced secondary trauma early on in my career. And my initial reaction is, what the hell's wrong with me? And my supervisors, who probably could make a long list of what was wrong with me, reassured me that I was just a human being working in very intense situations. So, I'm trying to think about, I just acknowledge how lucky I was, but I also think about how so many professions, medical providers, a lot of administrative folks work in the front desk and very sometimes intense waiting room kind of situations, outside sort of the child welfare, mental health, social work model of supervision, get little to no supportive supervision or kind of professional development supervision outside maybe a yearly employee evaluation sort of survey, which I think done in isolation is not all that effective if you look at the research. So I want to kind of ask the question to you to kind of start out our conversation. If you take our trauma-informed lens and maybe put it on a clinic or a justice facility or some place that might not traditionally have a robust, if any, supervision structure. When you think about those places, a school is another great example. When you think about those places becoming trauma-informed or trauma-sensitive, how is your thinking if you're consulting with a school, a medical clinic? How do you help them think about the role of supervision as part of their journey?
Big question.
You know, I don't have Kurt to ask him to today, so they're all coming your way, Jared.
Big question. So before we go to the supervision, I think we have to kind of frame it in is that trauma-informed approaches really are helping us understand what the impact of prolonged, severe, unpredictable lack of control, sense of helplessness does to an individual, right? So the trauma model really is about individuals, and that when individuals are exposed to tolerable levels of stress with adequate relational support, it actually serves to increase our ability to manage high levels of arousal. It increases our ability to observe, to identify, to modulate, to tolerate, and then to make a thoughtful response to situations. So really being stressed is a positive experience in our development. And that without stress, we wouldn't really grow. Right? So it isn't stress, it's the pattern of stress, it's the frequency of stress, and it's really the lack of available internal and external relational support that creates this vulnerability, right? And so what's the impact of that? Well, the impact of that is that when we're stressed, we feel a pressure and urgency to act, right? Is that that part of our brain that gets activated is really a defensive, protective mechanism that causes us to move quickly to action. The second thing it does is that it causes us in some ways, because we're in the here and now, is to act and have very little ability to think about the long-term consequences of our actions. It tends to push us towards thinking about things in more kind of right and wrong, black and white, extremist polarization kinds of positions as we become more stressed, right? It also causes us sometimes to create rules very rapidly, and that when we kind of challenge those rules, we feel a sense of threat, so that the rules begin to come and give us safety. But the rules are usually around physical safety. They very rarely are taking in the whole range of emotional safety, people's well-being, So when we're in a threat, we don't really look at the whole range of those things, right? So that these mechanisms have served us really well for hundreds of thousands of years when we had to deal with droughts, when we had to deal with saber-toothed tigers, when we had to do it, right? So when we understand we went through all of those weeks of talking about heart rate variability, right? And we begin to understand how important it is for us to be regulated, for us to engage in really higher order thinking. So when you look at the whole concept of working with people who are experiencing current threats, lack of food, lack of shelter, lack of predictability in their life, potential danger, living on the streets, potential danger, or in their houses which are unsafe and unpredictable. By the very nature of going into those situations and bearing witness to those experiences, it actually creates stress on the observer, right? We have to hold those experiences. When we're in situations where we're working on teams, that stress gets multiplied by the number of individuals that are in that group. So groups tend to take on this kind of defensive position. And what they tend to do is they tend to, in some ways, want to increase group cohesion, connectedness to the group, and decrease anything that threatens that. So conflicts, you oftentimes go into groups and they'll never point out a conflict that's going on in a group. It's always about somebody outside of the group, right? It's the administration, it's the Department of Human Services. It's very difficult because really connectedness is how they're managing that safety, right? We tend to see these groups not being able in some ways to hold alternative perspectives, right? So one of the things that Kurt talks about often is that our brain gives us this simulator that we can actually simulate our actions and see the consequences of what. When we're in this high level of stress, we tend to lose that capacity, right? So when knowing that I am a supervisor of somebody who is in now, who has to, in some ways, each week put on their gear and go into these environments that have these high levels of stress, then I see it as my responsibility to, one is be that relational buffer, right? So I think about how do I stay relationally connected and really in some ways understand, be open and curious to the person I'm supervising experience, right? Because together I'm going to, in some ways, bring my regulatory capacities to that. The second thing I try to do is I try to, by creating this relational space, is how do I increase their ability to be reflective, right? So it's not necessarily me giving you answers to problems. It's me helping you move out of this kind of defensive, reactive spot to the part of our brains that are uniquely human, that allow us to reflect on our experience, right? So I try to ask questions and explore, create safety, help them explore and look at and start to question things.
Which is just to chime in, I think everybody that's ever been supervised, I know we've had this joke, the question really is coming from your mouth. And you can't go through a Jerry supervision with the question really is.
So then the last piece of this is that when we reflect on our experience, we often leave thinking that we now understand reality. As opposed to, I now have mentalized and created some hypothesis about what's going on out there. I need to use that to explore it with the person I'm with, right? Which differentiates reflection can move towards projection. I could think of what I'm reflecting is actually reality. That's a projection.
Yeah.
But if I then take what I'm thinking and organizing in supervision as a potential hypothesis, and I go out and I say, I'm going to engage in some open and curious experience with the person I'm with to see if that hypothesis is valid, then there's a parallel process where the person I'm supervising is holding a space for the person they're interacting with, right? And so what we want to be able to do is approach trauma, not head on, and just say, I'm going to go in and experiencing everything, but really use our top part of our brain, our ability to reflect, to be able to regulate, to be able to tolerate, to be able to, in some ways, move closer, move away, to be able, in some ways, to work with trauma as opposed to be overwhelmed by trauma. And I think that's my role as a supervisor in a trauma-informed capacity. So that's mine in a clinical sense. Now you're asking about what does that look like in, say, a school?
Yeah. Well,
right?
I want to just let me unpack what you just said, because I think it's so important. Because I think if we, and this is, I think some of the challenges to the next question is what you just described. Totally agree, 100%. And I imagine if I had you describe how you approach trauma treatment from a therapist-client perspective, there would be a lot of similarities in how you just described supervision. Now there's some differences as well, but there's a lot of similarities there. And so, one of the things that really, I think humbles me in some extent when I think about this topic is, and I think this leads you back to the question of what about a principal? What about a medical director? It's a complex thing to have trauma walk through the door and walk into your classrooms each day, walk into your exam rooms each day. And I wonder, it's more of a wonder than, that I have concrete, double-blind study data on is one of the reasons supervision hasn't evolved in some of these environments is the complexity that you just mentioned. Because, if I'm not trained as a therapist, this can in itself, just what you said, might just overwhelm me and I want to run screaming and put my head in the sand. So I think it's great for us to give voice to the complexity from the supervisor's position, which also speaks to the complexity of work, delivering services to individual experiencing compound complex trauma as well.
Right. So, for me, I was trained in a psychodynamic model to begin with, right? But I also worked for a very long time in a treatment center that really was about behavior management, right? So if I believe my task in that model was to manage behavior, I didn't really see the need for all this stuff that I just talked about, right? So the first part was, how do we create a training model and a framework that allows us to understand that this relationship with this individual, I'm not just dealing with their behavior, but I'm being impacted by their internal experience, and I'm being right. So to kind of look at that. If you take it to medical model, for very many years, physicians, all they thought we're treating symptoms.
Yeah.
So it distanced themselves, even though it didn't really. So when you talk about a need for supervision, they would go, why? Well, I'm going in and doing a diagnostic workout I'm kind of looking at, right? But as the model changes, as we begin to understand that we are by nature designed to resonate with each other's states, right? That then this issue of providing some type of relational space for physicians, for teachers, for other, becomes a more viable discussion.
Yeah.
Right? So we had, the first thing is we did is when we went to a trauma model, we changed the paradigm. So people who haven't shifted are still going to argue, you don't need this because all I'm doing is delivering information to these kids.
Right.
And if they're not getting it, it's because of what's there going on. They need it, right?
Yeah.
So as we do trauma-informed education, now you raise that issue of how do I create the space to hold the people who are providing the service?
Yeah. And one of those things, and I love it. Yeah, oh, absolutely. Because one of the things that I try to verbalize in my trainings when I'm working with leaders, managers, one of the real, what I believe, we kind of talked about parallel processes and how emotions are contagious in our last episode. But one of the ways I really simplify that, and whenever you simplify something, you kind of maybe lose a little bit of the complexity to make a point. But I really see, and I've seen this play out in my career as well, is, really so many times the energy, so to speak, or the relationship between the supervisor and the supervisee really serves in many ways as a model or kind of a parallel process to the supervisee's ability to create healthy relationships with clients, patients, students, and kind of hold that space for their students as well. So I saw my role as a supervisor was, to sort of be that model of empathetic, compassionate, asking the questions, as you said, bringing curiosity into it, that support piece of it, being that sounding board, so that my folks would have the robustness, the resiliency, the curiosity, all those really, in many ways, draining intellectual and emotional things that we do as part of our work with folks, that they had the ability and capacity then to go hold that in. So I really see that parallel process that, hey, that quality of the relationship really, and again, I'd love to have data because I can't say predicts because I don't have the data, but I really think in many ways at least mirrors, if we can say that, the relationship so many of the direct care folks are able to create with the people that they're working with.
Right. So I remember many years ago, I was asked to go to a correction facility. And I began to talk about trauma, and I began to talk about the need to change our paradigm, right? Is that, yes, there were certain behaviors that got these youth into this program, but what's going to heal them and recover is having somebody who could be attentive, who can kind of be responsive to them, to kind of manage them, that the structure helps create predictability, helps create a sense of control for them, but really the change takes place in this context of this relational interaction. And we need to teach skills to get to where we want to get to. So again, this is an example prior to me doing, and it's different now, but back then, I was immediately labeled as weak, and I'm the soft therapist coming into this, and you don't really understand. And so really what they were telling me is the level of stress they were under and their lack of safety caused them to hold on to these control in the same way that the kids were holding on to control. Mm-hmm. Right? So that when you go in and you start to just talk about you guys need supervision or you need to have this kind of, it's not necessarily received. It's novel, and novelty represents threat. Mm-hmm. Right? So when we're talking about schools or medical facilities or police, right, to kind of look at it, is we have to, one, create that relationship that we have with us, mm-hmm. and two is help them develop a different frame to understand the problem that we're talking about, right? And it's kind of like supervision, where I have many years of experience and I could just tell you, here's what you should do.
Yeah.
And you might comply with me and go do it, but you're not really learning anything other than I got something out of complying with my supervisor.
Yes.
But if I engage you in reflective process and help you and question you and maybe give you some knowledge and information, you begin to think about the problems from a different lens.
Yeah.
And I think that's where we're at with schools and medical professions, that there's going to be some that are going to approach you and say, now that I'm thinking about it from a trauma-informed lens, I really have to start thinking about supervision and support.
Yeah.
You're going to have some that are still in a medical model or in a strict kind of, I'm a teacher in this. They're not yet ready yet to have the discussion or be open to what we're asking them, right? And so how do we create a change model to get to the question you're asking, and then have them kind of talk about what are the ways in which, for lack of a better word, supervision in your model, right, is support to do it. What does that look like in your culture and in your environment?
Absolutely.
Right? How do we help them begin to grapple with those issues?
Absolutely. And almost from, and I'll just throw it out there because I think it's very important in these, almost from a cost benefit perspective as well, because it's one thing if I come in like I did when we worked together at a child welfare facility, supervision was there. Right? I didn't have to say, oh, I've got to find a way to carve out so many hours of my week to supervise my staff. That there was that economic situation that already happened. You go into a school that has, 20, 25 teachers, so to speak, and you think about offering adequate supervision to those teachers, that all of a sudden becomes a very costly piece, much less looking at physicians, for example. So let's look at that, because I think that to me is one of the challenges I have, and I think so I'll throw out one piece of thinking of that is when we look at like the vicarious trauma, the secondary trauma, how and the levels of burnout in public health education and social services psychology. One of the things I can't answer well without supervision being a part of my answer is, how does a typical, because I think great supervisors can do things on the fly, but if we're talking about the standard deviation, right, the mean of that bell curve, the 66% of the normal kind of average supervisor, how does that individual check in and ensure that their staff are healthy and have not been impacted to really do all the stuff that you talked about to introduce this topic to us? How do I do that without some dedicated time? And I'd like to say every other week. I don't know if I believe that it's less than once a week.
So let me let's follow what I'm saying.
Yes.
First, we help educators change this model.
Yeah.
Understanding, right? Then we have to kind of have them begin to think about, I can get a social worker, a mental health professional who comes in, whose job it is to spend 30 minutes to 50 minutes with individual kids around the building. Or I could begin to relook at those positions to say, if I provide the type of support and reflective supervisory process to the teachers, would I have less kids to kind of right? So we begin to you say it's not all adding positions. It's, can we redefine some positions that we're trying to create a relational, healthy environment, not just respond to the individual. So as a therapist, I may get much more benefit out of spending 30 minutes with a parent teaching them how to interact with a kid than I would if I just interacted with that kid.
Yeah.
Right? Same thing in schools. So as we change the paradigm, we have to start raising questions. Is the way they're using the resource the most efficient way to get to what you're trying to get to?
Yeah.
And then you then say is, okay, you know what? We still have kids that we have to meet individually with. And maybe we need another half of a person instead of let's just go out and get, right? Because if right now my experience with schools are they get training and the teachers think the training is really about how to change the kids.
Yeah.
And then the interventions are about where to go with the kids. But really what we learned is when we create increased relational health with the adults, has significant impacts on the kids.
Yeah.
If you teach mindfulness training to staff, if you treat empathy training to staff, you have less behavioral problems, right? So again, as we shift the paradigm, we begin to look at possible solutions from different angles.
Yeah.
And so you're looking at it. You already. I don't know if you've ever seen. I have a picture, and maybe I'll send it to you. But I have a picture of a lake. But embedded in the lake is a picture of a baby, but it's in the background, right? And lots of people look at it right away and see the baby. Mm-hmm. Other people can only see the lake.
Yeah.
Right? But when the people who could see the baby take time to show the other people where the baby exists, then they go, oh, there's the baby, I see it. And I see that like as trauma-informed care.
Yeah.
Is that people are only seeing the lake and you're trying to talk to them about why they need supervision.
Right.
It's like, I don't need supervision. I got a lake here. What do I need supervision for?
Yeah.
But if they begin to see the baby in the picture, they begin to say so that's why we need extra support for teachers.
Yeah.
So I think that the fact that you're going in and even having these discussions is progress from where we were 5 years ago, right?
Absolutely.
But it's because we're beginning to see this general shift in our culture of understanding that really we are in individual brains and bodies. We survive in a social network.
Yeah.
Right? And that when we could create health in the social network, we have significant change. And also if somebody's acting out in a classroom, we tend to want to go and just deal with that kid as opposed to what's happening in the dynamics in the classroom. Mm-hmm. And with the teacher who's a member of that, that we might in some ways turn that situation into something that's positive. And I think that's my role as a supervisor, of to step back a little bit and help the individual I'm supervising reflect on their experience and then use that experience to maybe have an insight into the client, insight into maybe how I'm responding is in some ways related to why this client is. That's where you're getting, and that's why I think it's so important in schools, is that if we could shift educators' models, they may understand that their interactions may be interfering with learning in the classroom.
Yeah. Yeah.
Right? Does that make some sense?
Yeah, and I think, again, the other thing that when you're talking about this, or let me throw, because I think this works for both these scenarios, or if something major happens, because I see this in schools all the time, maybe a kid passes away, or a family that the school's had 3 other kids, a tragedy happens for them. So on one hand, really creating the best classroom as possible. On the other hand, these major things, where I think we can be effective as a system, whether that's a school, a clinic, whatever we're talking about, in holding space and giving people a chance to feel supported, feel grief, go through a process where this, or to look at how do I improve my classroom. That in my thinking, there needs to be a proactive component to both of those things. That if I come in and it drives me crazy. The supervision my wife gets is once a year, the principal sits in her classroom for 2 hours. And then that's supervision. Just makes no sense to me logically. But that's the model that they're under. And what I see over and over, and not just in my wife's school, what I'm talking about is then when major things happen, there's not sort of that relational trust and safety necessarily built for the school to move beyond the trauma and really deal effectively with the trauma that faces them. Or when something does happen in the classroom where I might have to give some tough feedback, which I know we've both done a lot in our career, where it's great to have the real energized conversations, but sometimes you got to give hard feedback because somebody makes a misstep or something happens. To have that supervisory relationship build up over time gives me sort of maybe some like something in the bank where I can then have those hard conversations. Or you already feel supportive, so you might come to me weeks earlier and not hold this in yourself because I'm proactively, we've got time to meet, 3 days from now, so we can handle it then, instead of it resulting behaviorally in some ways weeks later because I didn't even know you were struggling. So to me, there's such a proactive quality piece to this that I can, if I'm proactive and make that investment up front, I'm able to help people bounce back from hard situations so much quicker. And I can be a lot of times proactive before that manifests itself in other ways.
So let me ask a question.
Yeah.
Do you feel, do you feel as you go around the schools, because you train in schools and you train, that there's more of a openness that teaching social emotional skills is an important part of the academic process?
I see that a trend all over the country right now. Absolutely.
Okay. So there's an example of when we start to open the door to saying part of our charge is not only to deliver academic information, but the social emotional information.
Yeah.
Now I've shifted the lens a little bit, and now I have to somehow go in and make sure that the teachers know how to do that, right? So if I'm teaching math, I can't go in there and say, could you go in and teach us math if you don't know how to do the math?
Right.
Right? Well, it's the same way now with social emotional skills. We as this change occurs, you're going to see ripple effects of that change. And the question you're raising is, if social emotional is so important for learning and growing, isn't it important for the teachers in their professional growth?
Exactly. Yes.
Right?
Yeah. And I would say in medicine, the biopsychosocial model, which if you go back to what it originally was, it really fits into medicine in the same way.
Of course it does.
Yeah.
But you have to help them change the lens in which they're looking at what they think their job is.
Yeah.
And I think that then all you do then is raise that issue that I just raised is, I'm wondering now as you're teaching social emotional skills, how is it that you're giving enough repetition and practice to the people who are delivering these?
Right. Yeah. Yep. Absolutely.
Right?
Yep.
So there, you just raise that question and let them in their meetings try to struggle. So I'm going to a school on Friday to consult with them. They asked me to consult. They deal with a very, very medically impacted population, and lots of their kids die. So they now were having all these conflicts and fights about, after going through a training, they began to realize, I wonder if the reason we're struggling with not being able to make decisions and fighting over these things is related to the work that we're doing.
Yeah.
Right? It's like, how many years have you been doing it? And now you're because their lens shifted.
Exactly.
Now they're open. I'm going Friday to talk about what are the things that and because they have the special population, they actually have access to lots of resources.
Yeah.
They never thought of getting resources to bring in for the teachers.
Yep. Yeah. It's amazing. Yeah, absolutely.
Right? So there's a parallel of supervision.
Yes.
I led them to that as opposed to telling them, because I think if I told them without a relationship, they would have seen it as a criticism.
Exactly. And the other thing, because, with the time we have left, I do want to throw one more thing out there, because I think for me and my thinking about self-care as well as organizational individual achievement and performance and quality, there's also this is sort of a frustration I have that I'll say here. I say it nicely elsewhere. But I think we do a disservice to folks when we have maybe an annual, maybe we check up on it in 6 months, these performance reviews where we have everybody come up with goals for the next year and then never kind of revisit them with folks. So one of my other thinkings where I think supervision is so critical, I like to think about this from a concrete training perspective in two ways, really working to make sure everybody has a self-care plan. I think Bloom and Sanctuary called it kind of a safety plan that the staff would have as well. But
resiliency plan, a resiliency plan.
Yeah, absolutely. So what's your, because I want to have that conversation with you as your supervisor so I can help keep an eye on that, make sure you're taking care of yourself. But also, I want to know what you're working on professionally as well, because again, I really think there's enough research with the growth mindset out there and different other, Jim Collins has done a lot of great research in the business realm, is that we're healthier. One of the things that make us age well is if we have a purpose that we're working towards. There's all this research out there now that if I'm moving forward towards something, I always like to say it puts the hard days in perspective, because the hard days, if I'm moving towards a bigger goal, a hard day is part of that journey. If I'm just trying to survive my job, the hard day can become all encompassing. So, the final piece of this conversation, I think is while the social and emotional part is definitely, a huge aspect of this in a trauma-informed journey, I want to help people be better professionals. Now, I just like those conversations. They energize me. But if you're working for me, that means that our clients, our patients, our students are getting a constantly better version of my staff. So I want socially engaged people who are trying to perform. And, I know people, improve in isolation. But if you look at the research, motivational interviewing, which everybody knows I'm kind of, think a lot about, is we know one of the number one predictors of change if somebody supports you in your change process. So it's kind of, again, those parallels is rarely would we expect people in therapy, people in school to do everything on their own without support. And so I like to take that same lens and think about, okay, my staff's professional development, if I'm there working with them, supporting them, challenging them, I struggle to figure out how to do that without supervision as well.
So let's put that in a trauma-informed lens, right?
Yes.
One of the impacts of trauma or prolonged stress is a loss of a future orientation.
Yeah.
Right? So when you're talking about setting some professional goals, when you're talking about what knowledge, skills, and tools can you work on to improve yourself, that person is looking towards something in the future, which means that I have a vision that the future could be better than the present, right? And so that all of what you said really helps in some respect manage trauma. Mm-hmm. Is if I could get in the part of my brain and have something I'm working towards and kind of looking at. Data also does, right? You could have data that could be used to come in and say, what the hell are you doing wrong when I'm not reaching those goals? Or you could have data to say is, let's look at where this person started and how they're making progress and how we can kind of look at and how do we use data to kind of drive us so that all of these tools that we have available to us can be used in a way that traditionally hasn't been very helpful, or we could take from what we're learning about biology and trauma and use them to enhance our ability to be able to be in a spot to, in some ways, have growth instead of, traumatic disorders. Right?
Absolutely.
I can use that. So your point about setting goals and looking towards the future of thinking about what is our desired outcome for this person and how can we envision what would it look like when that person gets there, and to kind of look at that. All of those things are creating hope.
Yeah, absolutely.
And hope is such an important component of outcomes.
Yep, and a motivator as well.
Whether it be treatment or supervision.
Yeah.
So I think your point is really well taken, and how to put that into that trauma-informed lens is really, when we do that, we keep people to be able to use knowledge and experiences from the past, gain new knowledge and information, and then in the present reflect on it and figure out how to best apply it in the present. They're kind of looking at that piece.
Absolutely. And again, let's just appreciate the parallels of all of our episodes in some ways is building that strong relationship, building the safety, building the trust. And then on top of that, then, okay, how do we move collectively forward together, right? Where we may take, be that supportive person working with that. And I think, as far as like great things in my career that I love about pretty much every job that I've had an opportunity to be a supervisor is that experience. Part of this, like I want other people to have the joy that I've had, watching people grow as professionals, because for me, even though I really enjoyed being a therapist, what I really love to see is a professional kind of find themselves and find their passion in this and do amazing work. For me, that was always probably my best moments were those moments. And as somebody I know in our relationship who helped me do that, I think it's a great example of, you not just sitting down and throwing the ACE study in my lap, but then processing my excitement with it, processing my, wanting to change all of our systems and holding space where I could express the excitement and then giving me some realistic boundaries as well.
The last thing I want to leave people in kind of do it is that in my career, I haven't always had access to great supervisors.
Yeah.
Right? But because of my desire, I went out and found great mentors.
Yeah.
And I went out, and so if you're in a medical practice or you're in a school that is in the process of getting there but is not yet there, I challenge you to say this is important for me enough, and can I go and find some place that I can get this kind of experience with? I've been lucky enough to kind of have, Dr. Perry in my life to kind of help me think through things and learn through things to kind of do it. I had Brent Steele, who is to kind of looking at those things. So I've had really good, but they weren't always in the place that I was working with.
Yeah.
So I found my own interest and went out and sought an interaction with somebody that I felt could help me grow, and who could in some ways be with me in a way that I needed to be, to kind of look at that. So if you're in a place, you might say, well, you know what, I need this and I'm going to leave the place. It might be that you just have to find that someplace outside of work.
Yeah.
To begin to look at that, to meet your needs. So that really there's lots of people out in the field, both in your own field and across fields, that really love to share information and knowledge and to do it. And if you just seek that out, there's opportunities for you.
Absolutely.
So that's really what I would say for teachers, especially as they begin to recognize and have a trauma-informed lens. If it's not available, find where in that, and then advocate in the system and why the system's changing. Make sure you're getting your needs met.
Great. Let's end on that note, because I 100% agree. And, just to throw in, it's funny, there's been some great social network research that if we keep those smart, brilliant people in our lives, we're actually a lot smarter as well. And no better example than you with me, because, people just think I'm smart, but I've just asked you a million questions along the way and have always tried to surround myself and keep connected with those people that really inspire me. And it's kind of cool to be old enough to be one of those people for other folks.
On other people's shoulders. Right?
What's that?
We're always standing on other people's shoulders.
Absolutely. Absolutely. So what a great way to end. I love this discussion, Jerry. I think it's such an important piece of the puzzle. I believe Kurt's going to be joining us back next week. We'll sort of get back into the article section of our leadership journey, but this was a fun a little detour that I'm sure we'll reference probably with every other podcast on workplace and trauma-informed leadership coming up. So as always, I got some discussion questions here. If you're interested in having this with your own team meeting, you can find that, show notes and everything else at traumainformedlens.org. So as always, take care of yourself and have a great week. Jerry, any last words?
Goodbye.
All right, take care.